And I might miss some detail as well describing the effect from social network. What is the analytical units you're using for social network? Is the number of friends or the homogeneity and ethnicity?
So for this last stuff I talked about?
Yes.
So here, it really was a measure of, we weren't looking directly at number of friends, it was a measure of cohesion. So how cohesive was your company? Where we're looking at, was it cohesive in terms of occupation? Was it cohesive in terms of ethnicity? And was it cohesive in terms of age? And what we did is we basically created a weighted index of each of those things, and as weights, we used the regression coefficients that we got when we predicted who'd be deserting.
Is there similar work from other wars? And if so, how does your work compare?
So, let's see. So with other wars, it's, now I guess which aspect of the work? So for example, if you look at these last aspects, there's some evidence of, so during the Yom Kippur War, men couldn't get to the front on time, really. It's, so some men ended up in a tank unit that wasn't their own, and there's some evidence that if you ended up sort of in a different tank unit, then you're more likely to develop PTSD than men who were managed to end up in the same tank unit. So there is some evidence on that front. There have been, say, studies for the Vietnam War looking at just what's the effect of having been fired on and how many times, what effect does that have on stress. It's very hard to look at any measures of social cohesion with the Vietnam War because men get rotated in and out. So I think one of the beauties of our design is that you don't have this rotation, you're with these guys all the time. We looked into it, could we actually do this with some other wars, and unfortunately, there are a lot of pesky privacy considerations that would make a lot of this difficult. So that, plus literally sort of the company structure, would make it difficult to look at.
And when people read our POW paper, people asked us, could we do more work on the Holocaust and concentration camps? And we were fascinated by that, but we were not able to figure out how to establish networks of who was from the same hometowns in the camps to count by individual, to estimate models of the probability of survival and who was there with a lot of pre-existing friends and ethnic, family networks.
You know, unfortunately for World War II, so say for Japanese-held POWs, you don't have actually the full life history, at least in what's publicly available. It's only where were they released from, which really doesn't do it.
A lot of the experiments on social cohesion and pro-social behavior show that one of the key variables is your expectations for others' pro-sociality, and I'm wondering, would your data permit you to make the following study? I'm thinking you might be able to do this. See the extent to which early rates of desertion in the company influence subsequent rates of desertion. You could look for a change in the rate of desertion. Was that, I mean, did you happen to notice any patterns about that, or would your data permit you to look at that?
So we estimated this duration dependence parameter, but we did not, that was a simple one parameter model. We did not, so you're saying that there's some Bayesian updating of whether I'm in a free rider economist
There
company?
has been some work with these data looking at contagion.
Right, that's...
Where you do observe that there is some of this contagion. A lot of it is, so yes, you see all these other men deserting, you're gonna panic as well.
Yeah, I mean, you see it, for example, looting is very interesting because a lot of the studies of looting behavior find that people who are arrested in mass public looting often have no prior criminal record, suggesting that it's a contagion effect.
The trouble is here, you don't know, so if you have clear evidence of acceleration in the decision,
Right, that's what...
there are lots of possible explanations. One is, I'm in a non-cooperative group, so I'd be a sucker to cooperate, so I defect, which is what you were suggesting.
Mm-hmm.
Another is, the deserters weren't punished, there's a broken windows effect, so, those guys seem okay, so I'm gonna desert, right? And a third is, as the company is depleted through desertion, my odds of dying go up. So my temptation to desert increases. And you can't differentiate those just from accelerated desertion.
Is there any data on the marital histories of men after the war? So, for instance, did the deserters who went home, who were single, when they went home, they found it less hard to find a wife than the men who served honorably?
We think alike.
Yeah, we did. So I don't think, did we looked at marital, did we look at marriage? I can't remember. But I don't think we found much,
And
yeah.
that's, I was interested in capital punishment. That's,
Yeah, no, I don't think we found anything on the marriage front, though perhaps given, you do have a lot of men knocked off by the war. It's,
wait,
So those desertion rates sound remarkably high. Is that, do you know if that's common in other wars?
well, it depends, certainly in modern wars, no, part of it could be in modern wars, you're much better able to keep track of where your men are on the battlefield. If you go to the 1700s, you actually do have desertion rates on the order of 30%. But you had a lot of mercenaries then too, so.
Did you do a parallel study for Confederate soldiers compared to Union soldiers?
The problem with looking at Confederates is because they lost the war, they weren't eligible for the nice pension that came afterward, and therefore there wasn't this incentive also to keep track of all the records. So a lot of these records for Confederates are located at the state level. There has been some work looking at desertion among Confederates. And there it's a different dynamic, because once it's clear that the Confederacy is losing, it's then actually it looks like the more cohesive the company is, that that's when you get together and all decide, okay, we're gonna desert. But but that only happens at the very end when it's clear everything's
Did Bob Bowler put together some data on the Confederates then?
No, no. We've never touched the Confederacy because ultimately you can't really follow them through to old age. And one of the big interests here ultimately really was the old age angle. This has all been funded by the NIA, so.
So I'm wondering, some of your social homogeneity effects, are they in part due to being recruited from similar places, or is this all controlling for, you alluded to social networks before the war, or are these that they actually were making it was easier to make the networks?
We
in the
can't
units?
observe what was your social network before the war, except we can say, okay,
Well, the
black
birthplace.
soldiers were on the same plantation, that's some evidence. It's certainly possible that one reason we have an age effect there is because if you're around the same age, you're more likely to know that other person in the community. And therefore, maybe you have an effect because this is sort of this long-standing sort of social network effect, but we can't really get at that.
So I guess a question, something I missed is how were the communities actually organized? How were they recruited into communities? Were they?
It varies a lot. So at the beginning, it's you do have men enlisting. They would enlist with their friends. It's not necessarily sort of you're enlisting with all of your friends. You're enlisting with some of them. So there is some of this group enlistment that is going on, and yes, maybe these guys are all very similar. It's but you shouldn't think of all 100 men in the company already were pre-existing friends. It's these companies were too big for that. Later on, you start to have the draft coming in. So it's even though, so 95, despite the draft, 95% of the sample consists of volunteers. But one of the reasons it consists of volunteers was if you volunteered, you'd receive a bounty for enlisting, which could be up to $300. And that was a lot of money in those days. So these men might actually go to different communities and enlist there just to receive this bounty. So this introduces sort of all of this heterogeneity. And even once you're in a company early on in the war, you and maybe the one buddy might actually switch to a different regiment because you heard a rumor that, hey, this regiment is going to be hurt. So you can read sort of all sort of these different types of it. As far as we can tell, men actually had very little information about the type of company they were enlisting in. And some of them discovered that the officers were all drunkards, and then you have basically these men refusing to follow orders, So a lot of what you should think about with Civil War is extreme chaos. It's, there really wasn't that much organization here. If men didn't like their officers, they refused to take orders.
And so building on that point, because a point our critics kept coming back to again and again was asking questions of intelligent design. When we presented this at the University of Chicago, our old teachers could not believe that there wasn't an all-knowing Pentagon who knew which leaders would work best for which companies. And this, what Dora just said of sort of chaos in the assignment problem, which men were in which units.
They had problems with that at Chicago?
We did not compute with our friends and heroes. But this matters for the econometrics. And if there was perfect foresight of which men would fight well together and with which leaders, we would have more trouble testing hypotheses.
So, I don't know if I missed this, but in your cohesion variable, you had the occupation, age, and ethnicity, and place, the local community that they came from?
So it's basically a state of birth. So
Okay.
if you're born in the US, it's US state of birth. If it's born abroad, then it's where you're born abroad. So that's sort of for the basic cohesion measure. When we looked at our Andersonville data, there for ethnicity, we depended on the last name. So that could actually be different generation. You could be born in the US, but maybe you have an Irish name.
But what is the relative contribution of all these things to the effect that it had on desertion? Like, was one of these the predominant factor that was driving?
So I think occupation came in particularly strong. Unfortunately, we didn't, so back when we did this, the sample really was too small to look at the effect of wealth. But we did try looking at it. It looks like there is something there, but the sample, we didn't have enough men who actually looked across to be able to look at any homogeneity in terms of overall.
Dora, can I speak to that for a second? In the first paper that Dora and I wrote on social capital, and Dora, correct me if I'm forgetting my own work. There's been a discussion in economics of which empirical proxies for diversity matter. And Alicina and his co-authors argued racial inequality, while we came down to income inequality, is a more, in our other work, was a more
For
important.
the modern period.
In the modern period, that income inequality was more, in places, all else equal, places with more unequal income distribution of people are worse citizens. And so that was one of our sharper results. In the United States, yes.
So suppose people were of the same ethnicity, they could also be from the same place of birth, and those would be correlated and wouldn't know separately how they were affecting
Well, so this is a battle of multicollinearity. So we have these three different indicators, and we report the correlation. We have 300 war companies, and you have to hope that there's variation within those company-specific variables.
Yeah, when we looked at our cohesion index, we were just depending on place of birth. We didn't have a separate ethnicity indicator.
So you have this evidence that deserters suffered some negative consequences when they went back home. Do you have any measure? I mean, Joe already asked about your marital prospects, but income, number of children, property ownership. Are there any other indices that this disapproval actually translated into bad outcomes?
We had some suggestive evidence they were more likely to be laborers.
Uh-huh.
So it does look like it had perhaps some effects. The moving result was the strongest one.
Which? The
moving.
moving.
Literally, you have to work.
But that, I mean,
But,
you'd think that would be negative, but it'd be
But
nice
there
to
is,
actually
yeah,
have.
there is the labor effect too.
Well, but
Likely
there's
to
a
be laborer.
causation correlation. Could you sort that out?
So
Like, was it a change in occupation? Was it that laborers were more likely to desert in the first place, or that deserters were more likely
Yeah, no,
to?
so controlling for
Right.
previous occupation.
Yeah, you did, okay.
Another question. So My memory is that Andersonville, correct me if I'm wrong, there was a lot of prisoner-on-prisoner predation within Andersonville. It's kind of gangs stealing food from people and stuff like that. Is that right? So, are these effects of friendship? Having a big enough gang to steal stuff from your.
So Rob is engaging in good strategy, and so we were asked when we presented this at various seminars whether our POW results were about gangbanging, and what would matter then is not your absolute number of friends, but relative friends.
Yeah.
If the other team has 4 guys, do I have 8 guys? Because 8 is double 4. And our one piece of evidence there we're sort of nice in the way we wrote our POW's paper was that if Matt's there with more friends, that this is improving my mental health and my human capital, not my ability to gangbang. There was a regime shift where there was a very public hanging at one of the prisons at Andersonville. And we used that as a break point where order was restored through sort of a Nixon law and order regime shift. And we used that as sort of a credible regime shift date to test whether, if it truly was the case that this was gangbanging, do you see an interaction term there? And we didn't see that. But Dora, we had one other piece of evidence that I'm now.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't find that, we did find that there was sort of this leveling off of the effective number of friends. And so I've forgotten what the optimal number was and what point it levels off, but
Yes.
it definitely does.
So under gangbanging, you might see a convex figure of one enormous group versus the minorities of just picking them off. And yet we saw an effect from going from no friends to 1 friend.
So logically, this effect of being a prisoner with members of the community leads to good outcomes. So it could be that there are all these positive social network effects. My baboons show many of the same effects. So it's very interesting. But also try to think if it could also be related to fear of reputational costs. That if you behave badly and there's more people from your community present, that there will be reputational effects later on. It should also
Very
be
hard to tease out, the sticks and the carrots.
I'm
So
just
when you have
curious
greater
what you think
homogeneity,
about
you have
that.
both, right?
Just curious what you think about that from your perspective of looking at these data.
I think the way, I'll speak just for myself, I anticipating that we couldn't disentangle those effects. I think we never had that ambition, but I agree with both of the stories you guys just advanced.
And so we did look a little bit at characteristics also of the county, and you can really get that much on the town itself. And those really didn't seem to matter. So it really is sort of the company itself where you get most of the action. And I guess sort of where our big concern was was it the ideology variable, where you can't tell, is it because you're strongly ideological, or is it because your community is, and therefore, if you don't behave as if you were, you're in trouble.
Just following up, you have those long-term measures of sort of physiological benefits to having social networks, and that seems to speak to this, doesn't it? Where it's reputation concern, it's not clear why you get 30 years later lower rates of
I like the social
health
network
outcomes.
story because, it fits my intuitions about female baboons, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's correct.
I disagree, Karthik. I think because, there's a difference between the net consequence of the experience and the immediate proximate motivators at the start of the experience. So it could be the case, if you have a game in which there's punishment, right, and you're on the fence as to whether you're going to cooperate or defect, but there's punishment there, so you say, okay, I'm going to cooperate, and then you reap the rewards of cooperation. Everyone's really cooperative and things go well. Right? Well, the physiological system could be recording all of that too. So, hanging with your buds when everyone is doing what they're supposed to do is a good thing. That doesn't mean that the reason you didn't run away to start with is because you were with your buds. You can't differentiate.
So you mostly talked about kind of community-wide variables, but you could also look at individual variations in terms of predicting desertion or is there anything like that, or resilience?
So when we presented this to German economists, they were very excited that Germans were less likely to desert. And so people would pay close attention to it. These regressions have many variables, and with our focus on social capital, we tended to view those as control variables. But
No, but we control for own ethnicity, so were you born in Germany, Ireland, what was the other?
So Irish economists would get
England.
angry, German
So
economists would be happy.
Oh, the Irish was great.
The people who are higher income were less likely to
just as good.
desert. So again, this could be maybe because they're more committed to the cause, or it could just be if you're higher income, then maybe sort of your peer group is going to be much angrier with you if you do desert.
What was the native born effect? The foreigners were actually less likely to desert? The Germans?
No, the Germans and the native born look the same, but the Irish and the English were more likely to desert.
Then the Irish American. Is that Irish born versus Irish American?
No, this is just versus all native born.
Oh, I see.
There's a compound there, but because the greater people of Irish descent, so multi-generational families in the South, so if you have Union soldiers who are recent Irish immigrants, they're more likely to be fighting against people who share a cultural heritage with them than the Germans were. So there could be other incentives for that.
Yeah, it's not clear there. I mean, it's certainly if you look at, say, votes for McClellan too, they tend to be concentrated also in New York City, particularly, say, the Irish immigrant ones. So there was just much more opposition to the war among the Irish, and I don't think it's because of guerrilla fighting.
So you have this desertion measure of people's willingness to not free ride. There's been all these studies in World War II, or at least one study I know of, where people have looked at unit effectiveness in battle. So, and do you have any? I mean, so you have a whole bunch of, which units were victorious, which units were not victorious in battle. Can you relate desertion rates or any other measures to?
So Dora, can I make a point there? That there we had a weakness in the design, and my co-author may be about to throw a punch at me. But the issue was this, and Dora, please correct me when I misspeak. The units fought in regiments, and because Vogel only had a 1% sample, he's created a great data set, but ideally you would want to have multiple companies within the same regiment,
for sure.
because they're regiments have the same fixed effect, they're exposed to the same battle conditions, and we'd like to know whether more homogeneous units were better in those battles. But at least in our discussion of Rob's question, we didn't have enough companies within regiments.
Yeah, but even there, yes, they're exposed to the same battle, but everyone was arrayed sort of in a long line. So a company's experience could vary a lot, even if you're in the same regiment.
But there we get into the intelligent design issue. Was the Pentagon aware of which were their best units, and did they put their best guys in the front and their losers in back, or the configuration of how the attack would work? And so these strategy issues, it turned into a big game of stratego as we would debate these with folks.
Right, but there's a lot of, a couple months ago, I spent a couple of days wandering around Gettysburg, and, maybe, but there's a lot of chaos as well, and units get stuck where they get stuck because of all kinds of reasons,
We haven't really come up with a good empirical measure of how do we tell whether or not this company was effective. I think sort of desertion in some sense is the cleanest. You need your soldiers to stay, and we can measure it really well.
So we haven't mentioned what an effective unit would do, but this was a very homogeneous, there wasn't complementarities of skills, so what was expected of the 100 men? No, but can you answer that? They were loading their gun and shooting.
Yeah, it's basically, if you've got to stand your ground, load and shoot, it's, they're not sort of skilled jobs, there's no radio man or anything like that here. So it's, it really is very much an unskilled type of job.
So I have a question about, this is beyond the scope of the material that you presented, but whether the data would afford this. And that's whether you could look at intergenerational effects the consequences of, say, having been a POW, right? So if you have census data that tells us about age of first reproduction, number of children, longevity, you might expect some.
That may be the future grant right now. There's a pilot project that's investigating, is it actually possible to get information on the children of veterans? And how easy is it to link them? We're thinking we wanted to do it both for blacks and also for whites. So, but actually I haven't thought specifically doing it for POWs, but maybe that is one other generation to do it.
I mean, maybe a model there is the survivors of the Dutch famine during World War II.
Yeah. Though I think one issue, I guess, here is these are all men, so there's a question of how much does male malnutrition actually matter for later on?
Well, I mean,
if it shows up through income, then yes.
It's conceivable that there's genomic imprinting, right? That men are ingesting the methylation of genes in their sperm that are affecting the attributes of their offspring.
I just wanted to go back to individual characteristics. Another possibility, you've got profession data, and I'm wondering if there might be any correlation between profession and likelihood to desert that's apart from income. And it's because of, Rob, weren't you part of that coalition that the MacArthur group funded to go out and do the trust games and all the different, yeah. One of the strongest findings was that proclivities to cooperate in various experimental games was driven by whether or not you came from an economic culture in which cooperation was very common, or whether you came from a very an economic structure in which people mostly labored independently and there wasn't a lot of exchange and interdependence. And I was wondering, did you notice that any professions were, and part of this is I just finished running a conference that had both business school professors and law professors, and I regret to report that the business school professors were way more cooperative than the law school professors.
That's unusual because most of these studies find that it's the economists who sort of try and be like rational agencies.
We didn't have, these were mostly non-economics business professors. We didn't have any finance professors.
Nothing sort of particularly came out at us. I should point out that this time period, I mean, most men work for or so. Predominantly is sort of this big farming. Now, perhaps when we obtain some more information about officers, and we'll also be using the futures to actually, we don't have a lot of commissioned officers. It's actually to go back and see what matters for the commissioned officers.
You might get more variation in occupations.
Do you know if desertion was usually an individual decision, or if the groups of individuals decided together, which would probably make it less likely that they would suffer the punishment?
I think it depends sort of a lot of the context. So I guess there's sort of desertion kind of in the face of the enemy, which was considered much more serious than if it was just these guys who are straggling and sort of trying to avoid getting to the front and maybe run off sort of somewhere. But we don't, I mean, I guess other than sort of some evidence on contagion, which we don't really know how it goes, we also did look at a small sample of men who actually had a brother or a father in the same company with them. And there, sort of much to our surprise, it looked like having a brother or father actually encouraged desertion. So I don't know if these men would sort of try
with both desert?
Yeah. So I don't know if they actually would try and do it together or.
There might be another explanation there, though, which is that the family suffers a greater cost if both men are at the front together. Right? So the U.S. military in World War II, for example, tried to split up brothers for that.
Right. Though I mean, certainly one reason that men would enlist together is to sort of to help each other out. It's when disease actually really ultimately is the primary cause of death, and it does help to actually have a brother there who will nurse you.
Do you have desertion dates?
Yes, so we know when men deserted, and we know what happened to them afterwards.
So wouldn't the relationship between those dates and events, like the winning or losing of battles, help you dissect what might be on their minds when they desert?
Yeah, I mean, we do know that if the Union in the past 6 months, say, had been losing, or if that specific company had lost a lot of men, this increases desertion rates. So, I mean, they sort of behave kind of the way you'd expect in terms of the guys who desert.
Okay,
Yes.
we have time for one final question.
The title include heroes and cowards. Cowards presumably people who desert. Are heroes people who just stayed on and did not desert? Is that your definition? That's all, they just stayed around?
We'd like the seminar participants, these are the guys who stayed around.
I'm trying to look at the Medal of Honor winners, but there's been a lot of inflation in Medal of Honor winners since the Civil War, so there just weren't many guys.
We had long debates on Mike's point, that's, so we gave ourselves a B- for that, but we needed symmetry in our title.
It's a tough one, it's a tough one, yeah.